Welcome to this webinar on small-scale irrigation for new growers. So this webinar is the first of three. There's this week's, and then there's one next Tuesday, which is real-life stories of irrigation systems that three experienced growers have known, loved, and in some cases despised. And on Wednesday next week, we've got a session limited to 8 places for people who want to share their irrigation problems and get some bespoke answers from Pete, who's presenting tonight. And this webinar has been funded by Farming the Future. It's the last in what's been a brilliant series of 24. This is the 25th webinar in a partnership between us, the Organic Growers Alliance, and the Gaia Foundation Seed Sovereignty Partnership. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Pete, and I'll hand over to you.
Hi. So first thing is I'm just going to sort of ask the question, why was this needed? Obviously, last summer was incredibly hot and dry, record breaking, and 21 was kind of okay. Didn't need to get much irrigation kit out on our plot, but 2020 was also really dry. And that was the year that I set up a new irrigation system where I now work, and I was glad I did. And straight off the bat, we were using it. And obviously, on a bigger picture, there's a lot more, seems to be a real resurgence in small-scale growers popping up. Organic, regenerative, just, people wanting to grow a bit more local food, particularly since COVID and the supply issues around that, and the increase in food prices, and maybe a desire for a bit more connection to what we're eating. And unlike a lot of other aspects of growing, there seems to be a real lack of information out there on setting up an irrigation system. You can go and find out how to pile 10 inches of compost onto your garden and grow slightly dubious vegetables in it, but you can't find out how to water them effectively, really. So I've been sort of charged with the task of putting something together. Also, like, irrigation is pretty high investment, capital investment, if you want to set up a decent system, and it's also not a one-off job. You can't just get someone in to build it and then use it. You need to know how it works. You probably need to tweak it, and ideally you kind of set most of it up yourself if you can. And there's a wealth of different available kit out there, but knowing your way around it and what to buy, that's a different story. So I was just going to sort of go through why I have put this together rather than just chat GPT or something like that. I did bung a few questions into chat GPT, see whether I can get it to do it for me, but it didn't do too bad. Like, it came up with a lot of kind of good general stuff, and actually laid out a lot of its answers in a similar way to what I was sort of thinking of doing. So it was kind of impressive, but it just lacked detail and experience. So I don't want to overlap too much with the next session, which is where we're going to all talk about our irrigation systems we've known, loved, and despised. But I'm going to quickly run through various things I've had experience with over 25 years to just give you a bit of confidence that I'm not just bluffing it, although still a possibility. I've got a few notes up there, so if I keep looking up there, then that's why. So I started a place called Scrag Oak Farm, which was a 10-acre farm in Robertsbridge, and that was 3 years, my first 3 years growing, with a very experienced grower, and on a heavy clay soil, with 4 big polytunnels. We built a barn and a rainwater tank, and we collected a lot of rainwater and pumped it through PVC pipes. And we set up automated mist and leaf propagation system, which didn't actually work very well, but it was an interesting thing to set up. And so I had a kind of baptism of fire there with gluing PVC pipes together. All sorts of fiddling around. So it gave me a bit of a good start, and sort of gave me a bit of I suppose enthusiasm for the subject. Realized how important it was. When you have a dry summer on heavy clay soil, it just turns to brick, and it's great for a while. It holds the water, but as soon as that water goes, clay does not do dry very well. and it takes a lot of watering to get it back again. And so there's a bit of an art to watering clay, probably an art to watering all sorts of soils, but that was my experience. So then when I left there, I tried setting up a business, and we had a glass house with a reservoir next to it. And so I used a petrol pump to pump water up to a makeshift tank, and then a horizontal pump with a pressure switch and an expansion vessel to just automatically switch on and on when you wanted to switch taps on. And we built that there and ran that for a year, but it was a bit of a flop because we didn't know what we were doing, essentially. And I was really happy growing veg, but not very good at selling it. So I started going and working for a chap called Miles Denyer at a business called Hankham Organics. He'd just set up, and he kind of had the opposite problem to me, where he was very good at selling veg, but not so good at growing it. So we made a good match, and then we worked together for the next 17 odd years. And it was there that I really learned how to use irrigation kit, PVC overheads. We put millions of meters of PVC together, and I'm probably responsible for some big environmental disaster in China somewhere from all that. We had a tank supplied from the mains water and a vertical pump, pumping that around the glass house. It was all above ground, so it needed to be frost protected. So when it got really cold, there was no underground pipes that were insulated, so it had to be really vigilant about frost protection. I set up loads of dripper lines to save water, so it wasn't all overheads. And then we actually increased and reset them all again when we realized we put them too far apart. We actually had only the glass house and a little bit of field. So when we started expanding, we took on a bit of field across the other side of the Pevensey levels and grew some leeks there. And the farmer there had a PTO pump off the back of his tractor and a big tank. And we used to go down to Waller's Haven, which is essentially on the Pevensey levels, and pump water out and take it up to the top of the hill and then gravity feed the leeks from that. And then we decided that we needed to start collecting rainwater off the roof of the glass house, 7,000 square meter glass house. And so we had the potential to collect a lot of rainwater. And we looked into a borehole and we looked into a reservoir. We decided that a big tank was the best option. So it was 14 meters diameter, took 360 cubic meters of water, and it was just below the glass house. So 10 millimeters of rainfall was about 70 cubic meters, and 50 millimeters of rainfall would fill that tank. And then that would last us about 3 weeks in the summer. So there's a lot of water going in and a lot of water coming out. And we installed sand filtration, and then we upgraded the sand filtration. We expanded the growing area into the field at the back and set up sprinklers and supply pipe out to there. And then the landlord built a reservoir as well, because he had quite a lot of money and could, and liked the idea of being able to watch herons from his window. And so although we didn't use the reservoir water, we had a reservoir built right next to us. So it was very interesting being part of seeing that go together. And then we had to replace the pump, and then we had to replace the liner and parts of the tank. And I'm still maintaining the system, even though I haven't worked there for 4 or 5 years full time, or I'm no longer a director there. And the setup there, we put that all together in 2008, and it's still going pretty well. So moving on from that, I went to the school where I'm working now, and during lockdown, I managed to commandeer 20 teenagers to help me build an irrigation system. And that's based off an old submerged septic tank, which was decommissioned, I think, in the 80s, based on some of the crisp packets that we found in it. And we cleaned it all out and sterilized it, and it's about 10 cubic meters, and set up a system to draw water out of there. At the moment, that's being filled up by mains overnight, and then it's ready to use each day. But we're hoping to put rainwater into it. We also have an old swimming pool that's used as an ecology pond, and that could also be used as rainwater storage. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now. I have done some advice work for people who helped about 4 different people set up their irrigation systems, sometimes just a couple of phone calls, sometimes like a full spec. Yeah, that's my experience in irrigation. And also love the weather. I love geeking out on weather. I'm a surfer and I'm always watching the weather charts and seeing what the winds are doing. And that ties in very well with seeing how much rain has fallen or what the weather's going to do. So where my limitations are really is sort of boreholes. We did put in a heat pump at the school, 1,320 meter boreholes, and I was there and experienced the process of doing that, but I haven't actually used borehole extracted water. So I have written some stuff about it, but it doesn't all come from direct experience. It's limited use of using river and reservoir water. I have done it, but it's not something I've had to do for long periods of time. And there's also a lot of application systems I haven't used. So some of what I've put in the guide has come from just other growers that I've seen and things that are in catalogues. Things like sort of hanging spray lines in glasshouse and polytunnels. I've tended to use PVC and screw in bridge rotors rather than the sort of hanging about this long. You know, I've seen them and I've never used them, but I think they're pretty common and pretty popular. There's sort of solid set irrigation that a good grower I know and friend of mine uses. Really good kit. It all clips together. It's kind of aluminium pipes, quite lightweight, and does a really good job. Reel and boom system like Ian Tolhurst uses. We cover that a bit in the guide, but again, I haven't got much experience of using those and haven't used much gravity fed or low power solar powered pumps, things like that, which I think are probably the way a lot of people are trying to go, but there's still not a lot of stuff available out there, certainly for larger scale growers. So yeah, and off-grid stuff, essentially, I'm not very experienced with. So the guide is aimed at basically new growers because it covers the kind of basics, but hopefully like very few of us have done all of these things. So hopefully there's something in there for everyone. And if you're an experienced grower, probably it's a good thing to give to new employees or people who are coming onto the farm or other growers that you meet. So hopefully it's going to be quite a nice little document that's going to be useful. It's kind of designed to be a bit of a roadmap of known territory. So it covers a lot of bases. And if you've done something in there, you'll probably read it and go, well, that's obvious. But if you haven't done anything, it's going to be all those kind of real first step things. It's not a recommendation because I realize everyone's in a different situation, but I'm hoping that if people read it and get a lot of the basics, then they'll have got that first step and they'll be able to confidently take the next step. They'll be able to read catalogs, look through websites and kind of have some idea of what they're looking at rather than going in completely fresh to it. I kind of recognize that we really need to innovate, certainly reduce plastic use, reduce energy use, we need to reduce water use. So it doesn't really look at that. That's kind of hopefully somewhere where we can start to move down the line. But yeah, it's a good start. So I'm going to screen share and I'm just going to go through the guide pretty quick because obviously people can read it in their own time, but there's a few things I want to draw people's attention to. So there we go. So the first thing I just want to say before we get into it is I want to say a massive thanks to Susie for really getting this off the ground. She started all the discussions with me and with the Farming the Future, Seed Sovereignty, OGA, CSA, and drew all the strings together to get this started and managed to get enough money together to make it worth my while, thinking, yeah, I'm going to put what little free time I have into doing this. And I also want a big shout out to Phil Sumption, who laid it all out and has been communicating really brilliantly with me over the last 2 weeks about, and he's been happy to do every little change, every nuance, and thrown up a lot of stuff, put a lot of pictures in there, and really helped out with getting the whole thing looking professional. And also a mention to Charlotte at Camel CSA for her copy editing, reading it through and checking the grammar and giving me some much needed advice on making it sound a bit more slick. So that's the cover. So basically the way of, if I zoom into, oops, sorry, I'm going to zoom into the contents here. Can everyone see that? Is that, hopefully it's not kind of hidden behind some, it's actually hidden behind the little picture of Susie and I for me. But so the way I've divided it up is, if I move over there a bit, over here where it says source, storage, transfer, application, the first part is really about source and storage. So it's all the places we can get water and all the ways we can store it on farm. The second part is about transfer and application, so pumps and pipes and sprinklers and things like that. And then the third part is more to do with weather, soil, how much you might want to water, concepts like field capacity, absorption rate, so that you can get to know your soil, get to understand how much water you should be putting on, so you're not wasting water and you're not underwatering, because there's no point. And then part 4 is a glossary, because a lot of this stuff has a lot of technical terminology, which once you get familiar with isn't too bad, but if you're not familiar with it, it can be a bit daunting. So you can always refer to that. And I think Susie and Phil went through and put in bold, because I didn't make a great job of finding all the references to the glossary. And so all the stuff in bold can be found in the glossary if you're not sure what it means. And then at the end, there's just a recommended reading list, some references, and also a list of suppliers, which we put together based on people's recommendations of people they'd used and found good. And those suppliers haven't in any way contributed to this, so they don't have any vested interest. So I think I've sort of covered most of the stuff in what's not in the guide already, but I just want to sort of zoom in on this bit, because when you're starting off any kind of system design, there's certain things you need to take into account. And I think for irrigation, it's really important to really get down the things that the sort of outline of what you are and what you're about and what you're trying to do before you start going into all the different options that are available. So scale of operation is obviously important, because the bigger you are, the more water you're going to need. So your area, but not just your area, the intensity of how you crop, whether you're kind of incorporating grazing animals or lots of green manures, things that might not need so much water compared to the intensity of veggie growing. Thinking about your rotation blocks, areas of single crops that might all want to be watered the same amount at the same time. And so if you're growing half an acre of kale that all wants watering in one go, you're going to need a different sort of kit to if all your beds are 10 square meters and growing lots of different things. Your soil and your crop type is really important, because your soil in particular, you're going to have very different watering arrangements for sandy soils than clay. If you've got soils with high organic matter, it's going to be different to if you've got a very shallow, stony soil. And then you've got aspects like the absorption rate of that soil. You're not going to want to apply any more water than the soil can absorb. You've got the retention of water in that soil, the drought resistance of the soil itself, as well as the crops you're growing, and also the value of the crops. You know, if you've got high value crops, you're probably going to be a bit more on the case with watering than if you've got things which could cope with a bit of drought and aren't going to break the bank if they don't, you know, do 100% well. Your local resources are going to be the materials, but also what water's available, obviously, and the people that are around you, and maybe kit that's already there, or sort of installations that are already around. Your financial resources obviously going to be your capital. What can you spend versus the overheads of the ongoing running of the business, and maybe funding streams that you could get to help with those one-off capital investments. On-site working hours is pretty important, because if you've got sort of fairly low capacity, you are not going to be able to water everything in a short space of time. So being able to, if you're only there for sort of working Monday, Friday, 9 to 5, which doesn't sound like many growers I know, but possibly, or you might even be just there part-time, you're going to want to be able to get all your watering done in the morning, in a short space of time. So you're going to need bigger capacity than perhaps if you live on site and you can just keep things ticking away, switching taps on and off, going out when it's dark even, you know, all those things can really help spread the amount of time you need to condense your activity into. You might then think about automation if you're off-site a lot. I don't go into that in this guide too much, apart from just mentioning that you can get little inline timers. They're pretty useful. I use them for a few things. I'm quite forgetful, so I find if I want something running for an hour, I put it on the timer and then I leave it for an hour, and then I don't need to worry about the timer, missing the timer going off, and then in 2 hours' time going, damn it, all that, you know, all that sort of knowledge and geeking out on what I should be doing, and a moment's distraction, it's all gone up the spout. Another element of the on-site working hours is the complexity of your irrigation system. Experienced growers might be able to cope with a more complex setup, and especially if you're living on site. But if you're either relying on employees or part-time people or volunteers, you might want a very simple and easy to use setup. On or off grid and available power, what's it going to cost to get mains to your plot should you decide you need it, or you're better off going for a sort of low pressure system based on gravity, or using a kind of fuel to power your pump if you haven't got electricity. If you've got water and no electricity, you're basically best off probably going for gravity, some kind of gravity system where the mains water can be pumped into a tank that's high up, and then you feed that off, and then you haven't got to worry about the energy of transferring that water to your application kit. If it's the other way around and you've got no water and electricity, then you've probably got the option of some kind of getting a borehole in, or rainwater collection, or building a reservoir or something like that. But if you've got neither, then you're really into the innovation area. And I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you, but there's plenty of people out there who are in that situation. And I'm really keen to hear from them and find out what they're doing, because that's really interesting to me. Your site gradient, elevation aspect going to be really important. The gravity effects of pressure. So at the bottom of the hill is going to be higher pressure at the top of the hill. And if it's the same system, you're going to have to somehow counter that using pumps or compensation within the system. If you're farming on a slope, then runoff could be an issue. If you're over irrigating and soil can't absorb it, it might run off just in the same way as rainwater would. And if you're south facing or north facing, it's going to be different to temperature. Soil temperature is going to be very different, and you might find, depending which way you're faced or whether you've got shelter, you're going to get more or less wind. And so things like that are going to affect how quickly your soil dries out and how your irrigation kit is affected. Second to last thing there is cultivation methods. So are you using tractors and rotavators and things, or are you going no dig and lasagna beds or something like that. It's all going to make a lot of difference to the way that you set up your kit. Your weeding strategies, drip line gets right in the way when you're hoeing, and even any irrigation system gets in the way if you're driving your tractor up and down a lot doing weeding operations. Your bed layout, the dimensions, crop covers, all those things are going to influence the sort of irrigation you might want to put on different crops. And then last of all, just put owned or rented land, because that's going to affect your investment potential depending on how friendly your landlord is. It might mean that you went for, if you're on rented land and you didn't have a long-term lease, that you might go for something more mobile rather than burying pipes in the ground. So you've got these sort of long and short-term considerations to take into account with that. So that's really one area of the guide I just wanted to embellish on a bit, because I think it's quite important. I didn't want to overload the guide with all that sort of stuff, because I want to keep to the sort of nuts and bolts really of what irrigation kit is all about. So I'll whiz through now really. So part one just is looking at sourcing water and storing water, and that's the 14-meter rainwater tank that we installed at Hankham without its cover on it. I think it was due a liner change, so I took a picture of it. You can see the line is just kind of peeling off a bit in places. So this part is about, the first part here is about mains water, and that's really important because a lot of people use mains. There's a lot of small scale growing setups around now. A lot of them are quite close to mains supply and they're just plugging into mains, and actually there's a lot of regulations you need to really look at around that. So if you are thinking of using mains, or if you are already using mains, it's well worth checking this, and I hope everybody's compliant with the water companies. There's a bit in here actually that I think I talk about. Is they're really on the case trying to kind of keep us all keeping all the water system really safe, but they're meanwhile pumping stacks of sewage into the rivers and the sea. So well, I'll leave you to kind of read between the lines on that. This part just is touches on the water tanks, varying from IBC containers up to sort of galvanized tanks. There's a lot of tanks out there, so I talk a lot about galvanized tanks because once you get over about 10-15 cubic meters, that's really your option. But there are some quite good plastic tanks around, and you can even build tanks. We had one that we built the first time I worked out of concrete blocks. Then rainwater harvesting, varying from sort of collecting off the polytunnel and barns. Obviously at Hankham we collect off a lot of glasshouse, but it's good to really think about how much water you actually use, how much you're going to need to use versus how much you can realistically collect. I think it's great to collect as much rainwater as you can and store it, but often that's not enough in itself. You're going to need some backup. Even off a 7,000 meter glass house, we'd use it all in about 3 weeks in the summer. So we'd really do the rain dance, when the heavens opened in the summer. That was cause for a big celebration. There's a bit here about open reservoirs. That's mainly around the sort of planning aspects of building a reservoir, but also the reality of the size of a reservoir that's going to be useful. Even if you're a fairly small spot, you may need something a lot bigger than you imagine, because otherwise it's going to turn into a muddy hole full of mosquitoes if you undersize it and try to use all the water. There's another bit here about the next bit about using from water courses, and the main issue with using from water courses is, of course, you've got very little control over the quality of the water. So then the last one here is boreholes. Let's say 4. Sorry, I think it says 4 up there and it probably should say 6, but hey, there's still some edits to do. So yeah, boreholes are amazing. Like once you've got a borehole and it works, great. But I mean, for me, there's really two issues. One is that really the best source of water? If you can collect rainwater or use surface water, that's probably better. The quality of borehole water can be variable. It's nearly always got some issue. And then there's a big cost to it. It's quite a big capital cost, and there's no real guarantee, especially if you're in an area where boreholes are not frequently installed. So there's a whole heap of stuff there about, if you're thinking of a borehole, what you might want to consider. So that's really the end of part one, which is your where's your water coming from and how you're going to store it. And then we go to part two, transfer and applying. So there's a bit about designing a system, things like freeze protection, air bleeding, what your pressure, what your flow is going to be. Now, pressure and flow are really important things to understand, and there's some links at the end. They're essentially two completely different aspects of a system. They are related, but pressure really is how badly water wants to get from one place to another, the force with which it will move, or the amount of resistance that it will push through past, whether that resistance is the size of a pipe or the amount of gravity it's got to work against, or how much you can keep your thumb on the end of the hose, whatever that is. That's all down to pressure. Flow is literally the amount of water that you can get from A to B in a certain amount of time. So those two things are very separate concepts, and it's good to really understand those if you're going to be looking at any kind of serious irrigation system. And then looking at coverage, access, compatibility, how much water, how much area have you got to cover, how much of the system you want to get to, and then what fittings you might use if you've already got a system. Can you make it compatible with the existing system, or you're going to have to start again? And then isolation. You want to be able to isolate. You want to put in a whole heap of valves, stopcocks, so that you can isolate areas of that system if possible. So if we look at the top part, there's a list of the things that come next, which is essentially all the parts, like in the Lego kit, all the little bits and bobs you stick together. And it's going to go, it will go through pipe work. So there's PVC pipes, high density polyethylene, medium density, low density polyethylene, hoses, and various various sizes and uses for those different types of pipes and hoses. And then obviously you're going to need a pump to move stuff. So there's a few pretty pictures of pumps here, and a little table just laying out some kind of basic information around the types of pumps that are available and what you might want to use them for. The filtration bit is pretty short. It's pretty obvious, what you're trying to do with the filter. But if I go back a bit, there's a picture of there's a picture of a sand filter setup that we built at Hankham. And this was it's still running, and it works brilliantly. And we don't do any other filtration of the rainwater. This takes all the bits and bobs out that wash off the roof. And the water that comes out is pretty clean because the red one has got biochar in it as well. And that essentially supplies the whole glass house. Like I said, in the summer, the tank gets through about in 3 weeks, it gets through most of the contents if it's full. And so through most of the year, everything's through rainwater. But then once it gets to the warm part of the year, when the water in the tank can get a bit fetid, it actually gets used up pretty quick. And then we're on to mains. And so that maintains the quality of the water for what is essentially sort of high value crops, mainly sort of salad leaves and that sort of thing. And so what we don't want is to be having water getting in any way quality compromised. And so using the sand filters and then having this kind of limited amount of time that we would store the rainwater for really helps with that. I'll go back down. So then we move on to the interesting bit, all the different sprinklers and kit that you can use. The thing with this is there's heaps and heaps of different things out there. And you might find that somebody recommends something. You might find that you pick up some secondhand gear from somewhere. Essentially, it doesn't really matter if it works, great. But you really want to think about how much work is it? Does it suit your, going back to the initial list of all those things, what type of soil you've got, what's the absorption rate of your soil, what's the area that you want to be watering at a time based on the number of different things you're growing. It doesn't matter what the sprinkler does as long as it fulfills all those things. And essentially all it's doing is taking water and chucking it on the soil. And so there's some designs around that have been around for decades and they're still going strong, like the impact sprinklers. And there's little pin jet sprayers, there's rotors, there's a lot of different things. And so I don't really cover any specifics here. I kind of try and keep it general. And certainly there are people who read this and go, hang on, the one that I use isn't there. And probably there's going to be a lot of things that aren't there, but they do the same thing. So you'll find in the catalogues or wherever you look that you'll find something that you think suits you. Some things that I haven't really covered, things that are like daisy chained, like the sprinklers that you get, they're like a standalone unit and then they're daisy chained. They're great if you've got different size areas, so you can shorten or lengthen the line that you're delivering to. But they're more work, obviously, because there's a lot of clipping together. So sometimes just rolling out one line with lots of click, click, click can be a lot quicker and easier. And like I said before, I've done a lot of work in glasshouses and polytunnels, and I've always used PVC overheads, but there are alternatives to that, which I don't mention here, but they're essentially the same thing as the little micro sprinkler that's at the bottom of the page there, but they just hang down from the ceiling. So don't be upset if your favorite one isn't here. And there's a little bit about other fittings at the end. We've got a section on drip line, which is pretty straightforward. That I think most of what you would find in a dripper system is covered there. And then we move on to sort of threaded fittings, which can be used to link different systems to each other. You know, it's really great having that system of the British standard part, despite the fact that there's loads of standard parts. Most irrigation suppliers, when they say it's a BSP fitting, you can be pretty assured that as long as you get the right diameter, that's going to fit into your other BSP fitting. So you can link all sorts of different things to each other. So then we move on to the bit, I think it's, there we are, part 3, where we talk about how much to water and when to water. And this is really important because a lot of people just think, soil feels a bit dry, better put a bit of water on it. And it's very easy to overwater, and underwatering can just be a waste. You know, you can just spray a bit of water to the surface and within a couple of hours it's all evaporated. Nothing's got down to the plant roots. So knowing when to water, knowing how much to water, knowing what your soil characteristics are is really important. And around this, just having a good knowledge of the weather, how much rain has fallen, because no point in watering if the rain's done it for you. And how do you know how much rain has fallen? Like, it might look wet on the top, but sometimes you can scuff the surface, especially if you have some light summer rain and it's literally just a little splash on the top and it's bone dry underneath. And other times the top can look really dry because it's been windy, and then you push it aside with your foot and underneath is perfectly moist and fine. So knowing how to sort of look at the moisture is important, and measure what's fallen. So yeah, having some kind of gauge of how much rainfall you've had, particularly in the middle of the summer. While we're here, how are we doing for time, Susie?
You've got about a quarter of an hour until 8 o'clock. So Put around one.
What I'm going to do is just stop the screen share and just show you. So these links here, the Met Office ones, I think anyone who's thinking of getting into growing and wanting to set up irrigation, especially on a larger scale, should really be looking at the weather. Sorry, I'm just going off piste a little bit here. I'm going to just open a couple of links that I've emailed myself but didn't have up and ready. And what do I need to do now? Go back to screen share. So this is real-time Met Office rainfall. Looking good. Let's see if the other one works. Okay, we'll do this first. Where are we? Tuesday, 18th of April, 2023, 0 hours. So that was first thing this morning, midnight. And we can see that the isobars here, which is the pressure, essentially atmospheric pressure at ground level. And it's really good to get to know how to read these a little bit. These charts show you the sort of patterns that are happening. And when you look at the forecast and it says it's going to rain tomorrow, you may or may not believe it. 24 hours are usually pretty reliable. 48 hours may be a bit less reliable. 4 or 5 days ahead, really it's anyone's guess. However, if you know a little bit about reading these patterns, you can look at the weather forecast and say, yeah, that sounds like it's going to be pretty spot on. Looks like there's a big low pressure coming through. Or it might be that there's really no knowing, and they've just put some random clouds and sunshines in there because nobody could really guess. And they might sometimes have a percentage certainty linked to the weather forecast. But if you've got your own percentage certainty, that's going to really help. And so where there's a high pressure here in the middle, you can see that the isobars are going to lower and lower pressure until they get down to a low pressure point. And usually you find the wind is traveling from low to high. Obviously, if it's pushing down here and it's pushing up here, it's going to be traveling from high to low. So if it's coming across, if you've got the weather is sinking here and lifting up here, is creating a low pressure where basically everything's sort of moving up, and there's a sort of vacuum at the bottom, and that draws in from the high pressure to the low pressure. But because of the way the Earth's spinning, everything kind of takes these circular vortex routes. And so along these isobar lines, you find that's the way the wind's going. With a high pressure, it will be going clockwise, and with a low pressure, it's going anti-clockwise in the northern hemisphere. And just starting to pick apart some of these maps over time, you start to pick up on patterns, and you can relate those patterns to the rainfall. But it looks like Met Office are not downloading the rainfall. So, well, that's a bit of a shame, but it was a bit of a detour anyway.
Is that it, Pete?
Sorry?
Is that it?
Yeah, I think so. We're go back to you somewhere. Stop share. There we go.
Stop sharing yours. Can you see mine?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get back to great. So I'll just go back to the irrigation guide and just run through what we were looking at there, which was so weather and climate. Application rate, really important to know how much your kit is putting on, and there's some calculations that can be done here, and it's important to know your soil characteristics. And so we've outlined a little bit here how you can start to determine what your soil, how much soil water your soil will hold on to. So the field capacity of your soil will be a percentage of the soil that's water once all the excess is drained away. And that's the kind of bit you need to keep happy. There are a lot of complexities in this, but as a basic rule, if you keep your field capacity somewhere between 25% and 100%, then you're not going to be watering too much. You're not going to be underwatering. You want to keep. So we've got a little bit here about field capacity, like judging field capacity by squeezing the soil in your hand. It's really nice to have a test that you can just go out in the field and do. You don't need any kit. You just need to learn your own soil, and when you squeeze it and how it responds to being pushed apart and squeezed between the fingers, what that's going to mean in terms of moisture content. And then you can look at that at different depths of the soil. You can just dig a little profile if you really want to get down a bit deeper, and then you can get a rough idea of the volume of soil that you're wanting to water and the percentage of moisture that's in that soil. So there's all information here about starting to calculate our moisture content, and then knowing your application rate of your kit, roughly how long you've got to run it for to get it back up to maybe not 100% field capacity, ideally pretty close to it though, because you don't want to be wasting too much water down through the profile, but you also don't want to be just watering the top and then that disappearing, and then watering the top and that disappearing again. You want things to be, it's better if they're moving slightly down than just evaporating off the surface. Certainly in protected cropping, that's pretty important, because otherwise you get a build-up of lots of salts on the surface. So there's a bit at the back that's a glossary. It's just a glossary, that's self-explanatory. There's a recommended reading list here, and there's a list of suppliers. And yeah, that's it. Thanks to Funding the Future, Farming the Future for funding. And thanks to Phil, and thanks to Susie.